Next, I'd like to introduce Eric Davidson, who's the director of the Appalachian Laboratory, who is going to be running this next panel.
Thank you, Dave. Well, I'll ask the panel to go ahead and take their seats here. We have a great panel that has a broad diversity of career stages and disciplines. We've already heard about the several references to the Lake Wobegon situation of our students being above average, which of course is true, and we also know that our women are strong. The part about it that I question about is whether the men are really good looking. I'm not sure about that, but we're going to proceed talking about sustainable landscapes and seascapes, and in the course of this panel discussion, we're going to talk about what those three words mean. And I'm going to start out talking a little bit about what we mean by sustainable. Of course, that could take up our whole 40 minutes or a whole day, but we're going to short circuit that by adopting the 1987 Brundtland Commission definition that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We should also think about what scale we want to talk about sustainability. It can be addressed at the individual farm scale, the individual aquaculture operation. We could be talking about at the global scale with, we've talked a lot about climate change, global carbon and nitrogen budgets, invasive species, ocean pollution, acidification, and so forth. But we can also focus on sort of the intermediate scale, and I'm proposing that, at least for the sake of discussion, for beginning our discussion anyway, that's what we focus on here. And in that case, we're talking about a case study of the Chesapeake Bay and its watershed, is that intermediate scale. An UMCES faculty writing team that put together this topic came up with this statement. Sustainable agriculture, aquaculture, and fisheries seek to produce food of sufficient quality and reliable quantity to nourish current and future human generations in perpetuity, while minimizing negative environmental impacts. Sustainable food production systems integrate within larger landscape and waterscape management strategies for maintaining environmental quality, biotic diversity, and a wide range of ecosystem services. So that's what we're trying to address in this Chesapeake Bay watershed that has, I think, something like 18 million inhabitants, including farmers, owners of forested land, urban areas, residential areas, watermen, and all of the ecosystem services that this mosaic of forests and farms and human habitation and waterscapes provides. I'd like to start by asking Helen Bailey, who is Associate Research Professor at the Chesapeake Biological Lab, to tell us her view of what we mean by sustainable seascapes, or what we're talking about with seascapes, and then give us some examples of some of the work that she and her colleagues are doing. Helen is, her specialty is spatial ecology, movement ecology, habitat use, and selection modeling, assessing environmental impacts of offshore energy. She's well known for her work, citizen science project called Dolphin Watch, and she's also written a children's book on leatherback turtles. Helen.
Should I stay here?
Yeah, I suggest just the panelists stay in place, yes.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about seascapes and three main points. So firstly, I'm going to define what I mean by seascapes. We just heard about avoiding jargon. Sorry, we've thrown in a word already. And then I'm going to talk about what are the advances and challenges that we're facing in seascape ecology. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of communicating our work, and as we've just touched on in the last panel. So first of all, what do I mean by a seascape? We're talking about a spatially heterogeneity in the marine environment. So a lot of people, I think, imagine the ocean, and I'm not talking necessarily about this audience, but if we just think about the public, they think about the ocean as a relatively featureless place. It's just this big, wide blue. But actually, we are discovering that there is tremendous structure, physically, chemically, geologically, and animals can use this as cues. We are now finding that there are animals traveling thousands of kilometers and being able to return to almost the same spot, that they can recognize and detect these cues, these gradients, and this structure. So seascape ecology is really the application of landscape ecology to the marine environment. But there are some differences, because in landscape ecology, the concept of patches has been really central. And there are some analogs. For example, you can think of oyster reefs or coral reefs as similarly having this definitive geographical patch. But there are also other parts of the ocean, particularly in the pelagic environment, where those boundaries are much more diffuse and harder to specifically define. So we are applying landscape ecology principles, but we're also developing new approaches. And I just want to point out that just like landscape ecology does not refer to a specific scale, neither does seascape ecology. We're talking about across a range of scales, from fine temporal and spatial scales to large. And this brings me to my second point about what are the advances and challenges. So we are very fortunate that we are living in a time where we have tremendous information. We have ocean observing systems and ocean models, many of which have been initiated by UMCES scientists. That means we have tremendous understanding of our environment. And traditional approaches have involved collecting the data on the environment, on tracking or surveying the animals, and then putting this all together and analyzing this data. But it means there's a time lag. We have actually analyzed data that is now in the past, even if it feels like the recent past. It is already past. And with our rapidly changing ocean, it means that these models may become increasingly inaccurate. Now, of course, every model is imperfect, but in a rapidly changing ocean, we may be experiencing ocean conditions that just haven't occurred, or they're occurring much more extreme events, much more frequent events, for example, such as storms that are relatively rapid events but can occur over large spatial extents. So really, we're going to be, with our expertise here at UMCES on many of these key species and systems, this places us very well in trying to develop innovative approaches for dealing with this challenge of these changing ocean conditions. And we may well need to move to real-time systems, just like we heard for the urban systems, where we need to not only be using models, but also verifying that with real-time information. And that's been really critical. This has come up a lot in relation to our offshore wind work, where we know that the models of marine mammal distribution and fish distribution and seabirds, we can't be 100% sure. We can't have a 0% risk. And so really, the best way to mitigate is we need these real-time systems, and in this way, we can develop more effective mitigation strategies, because we not only have a changing ocean, we have various new human activities, and I just heard today there's also potential approval for seismic activity off the Atlantic coast. So I just want to finish up with the point about communication. I have certainly learned through my offshore work that it's important not to just work with local, state, and federal agencies, which UMCES has a tremendous history with, but also with industry, NGOs, fishermen, and all the other stakeholders and end users. And not just at the end of the project, but right from the design part through to development, to really understand their needs and make an effective product. So finally, I think the expertise at UMCES in oceanography and aquatic ecosystems means that we are well placed to meet the current and future challenges to protect and secure our seascapes in a rapidly changing world.
Thank you, Helen. So to contrast seascapes with landscapes, I'm going to ask Mark Cochrane, who's professor at the Appalachian Laboratory. His specialty is Earth system science, wildland fire, climate change, ecology, land cover change, remote sensing. And I've asked him to give us a little primer on what landscapes are all about and talk about his experiences dealing with science sustainability issues in landscapes. Mark.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going from the surf to the turf now. Okay, what Helen laid out for how a landscape or seascape works is the same whether we're under the water or on top of the water. We're looking for how these systems function, so we're looking for how ecosystems are going to work in terms of pattern and process, and how that will change as we alter that system. So ideally, what we want to be able to do is take that knowledge and then apply it so that we can actually look forward and project where we think that landscape and how it functions, all those ecological services and processes are going to respond under changing land use and changing climate. And in that sense, we move from just the idea of pattern, process, scale, which is landscape ecology, to actual ecological forecasting, which I like to think of as saying, if we actually know what we're talking about, we should be able to say something about where we're going to end up that's realistic. So it's not just saying, hey, we ran a model and it says this, but being able to do it in such a way that we have some statistical rigor where we can actually put some uncertainty on that and say, these things are likely to happen in these places with this probability. And it's hard to relate probability to the public, but they use it all the time. Anybody who looks at weather reports nowadays, it says 30% chance of rain, right? So it's that kind of an understanding of how all these things link. So in my own work, what I try to do is look at how ecosystems and human activity and climate, are linked, shaped, and transformed by wildfire. And I didn't set out to do that, but that's what I ended up working with. And I found it to be a very powerful way of seeing things, because fire is actually pretty ubiquitous on this planet. And where it wasn't, we've managed to be installing it, shall we say. So, for example, I've done a lot of work in the Amazon, where we look at rainforest, and most of the people in this room have been hearing, like I have for decades, about how they're cutting down the rainforest and burning it, and it's all going to be gone. But what I look at it is how we've actually changed the way that whole landscape functions. So we took a system that didn't used to burn at all. We cut down trees, dry them out, burn things. And then lo and behold, after a while, these fires started getting away and going places we didn't want them, such that when I was down there in the El Nino in 97, 98, we had millions of hectares burning in standing forests, which was never supposed to be able to happen. And so basically, with my work, we've been able to show how a function of people lighting a match next to a forest, and just, if you do it long enough, eventually you'll have a drought that's dry enough that will allow that fire to spread. So that's not really that surprising, but what becomes surprising is that once that happens, you don't go back to the system you had before. You have a system that's degraded, and you don't need a once in a century kind of a drought. Now you need a once every 2-year drought, and you can get another fire, and then another fire. And so you set up a system whereby there's a feedback, and this gets worse and worse. Now, the Brazilian government's done a good job of reducing deforestation, and so we have this idea. We like to think of an easy solution, and we can fix things. And they were actually able to reduce deforestation by 75%. And so you'd think, hey, wow, the fire problem should be a lot better now. And what they found was it didn't really make a whole lot of difference. Why is that? Because people don't really think of cause and effect and how things work. But most of the fire is not the deforestation, actually. Even at the height of deforestation, that was about 2 million hectares a year. That's a lot. But 20 million hectares a year was burning in the areas that had already been cleared, because that's how they're either managed or unmanaged allows fires to spread. So we have fire going over large areas where we don't want it. And once you set that in place, now you set up a process that continually degrades the existing forests, especially around those edges. But those edges, you fragmented it to such an extent that a large percentage of that forest is accessible. And so we start having a collapse of these forests. Similarly, I work in Indonesia, where it's basically the same principle, only I work in the peatlands. So you just take these forests, you put it on top of peat soils, they've drained them, cleared them, and now we have fires there that it's not so much the intensity of the fire, it's the fact that you can't put them out. Once they burn into that soil, we have so much power and energy coming out of there that we can't stop it. And our biggest problem there isn't the flame so much as the smoke. You know, we talk about the California fires right now. 83 people died. How many people know that in 2015, roughly 100,000 Indonesians probably died in those fires? And it was mostly from the smoke. Okay? And so in there, we had, you know, we say, oh, the problem's carbon. They're the third largest emitter in the world. Why? Mostly because of these fires. Over half their emissions are from these kinds of fires and such. But if we were to stop all the fires, it still wouldn't stop the carbon problem because those peatlands, once they're drained, they start degrading. So unless we re-wet that, we can't stop it. Here in the US, we're trying to manage fires. One of the things I look at is how we do fuels management. And we have all these prescribed fires or thinning and all these processes. And so what we did is we actually looked at all of them. We had to literally call everybody and find out what they had done on these landscapes and take all the fires over a period of 20 years and look at which types of treatments were impacted. And we had to show that we could see a difference where they were burned or not burned, but then do basic modeling of fire spread over and over again in a stochastic fashion so we could say what the effect of those treatments were. And do they work or not? Well, on average they do, but we don't burn average places. So what you find out, it depends on what type of treatment you put and where, that, you know, whether you'll actually have these treatments do what you want. So we've learned that you can place them to protect some areas, but it will basically shift the risk to somewhere else. And I think that's it.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I note that he was talking about predictive ecology and or predictive, was that the term you used? Predictive ecology.
Yeah.
And I noticed that when Tom Miller talked this morning about how UMCES was originally set up in 1925, and they used a very similar term as to what, that's where they use predictive ecology. What he's talking about is ecosystem forecasting. Mm-hmm. But really, they're largely the same thing. So we've looked at big picture, seascapes and landscapes. Now let's focus in a bit on food production within each of those. And so Jake Hagedorn, one of those super above average graduate students, but with full disclosure, he's my student, is going to speak to us about his project that's related to agriculture on the Delmarva Peninsula and his perspective of working on that as an UMCES student. His area of specialty is in biogeochemistry, soils, and agriculture. Jake.
Thanks, Eric. Everyone? Okay, good. All right, so again, my name's Jake. I'm a student at the Appalachian Lab. I do a lot of my work on the Eastern Shore. So I broadly study human impacts on biogeochemical cycles, and the current project I'm working on is evaluating the effectiveness of a best management practice on the Delmarva Peninsula. So we've studied the environmental impacts of agriculture, especially on the Eastern Shore, and we're well aware of the issues that have come about because of agricultural practices, and there have been quite a few innovative solutions to reduce some of those environmental impacts. So, but it's not only important to measure and monitor those mitigation strategies, it's also important to try to understand if there are any unintended consequences as a result of those mitigation strategies. So in my case, we're concerned that what we have as best management practice, and it is improving water quality, it's reducing the nitrate coming off the fields, but is it also increasing greenhouse gas emissions? And that's the unintended consequence. So that's the question we're asking in that landscape. To kind of switch gears a little bit, I just want to tell you a little bit about kind of my experience as a student in UMCES. I think one of the reasons that I chose UMCES and what attracted me to this institution was the opportunity to work with diverse expertise. And this interdisciplinary nature of UMCES and the project itself is kind of what I thought would help expand my horizons to see the different connections between different fields. And so far, that has been achieved. And one positive example in my experience so far is an opportunity I've had to kind of get a behind-the-scenes look about how science is done, not only to work with scientific researchers and understand the research process, but also to serve on committees, to be on a search committee, to be on a curriculum development committee. Those experiences are really important, especially if you want to stay in academia, understanding how does this whole thing work, how does it function. Earlier, they were talking about groupthink and working together in a group, and I feel like I've had lots of opportunities here to work in a group. The last thing I want to share is kind of in that same vein. One UMCES goal that I think we should continue to strive for, and that has been good so far, is collaboration between the labs, between AL and all the other labs. And while we have varied expertise and we have different geographical locations, I think that if we can get together and get students together working on projects together, it enhances both our scientific gain and the students' personal knowledge. And so the current project, give you an example, the current project I'm working on is a collaboration between the AL and Horn Point Laboratory. And so the AL, our team is kind of responsible for the soil gas emissions and for essentially the soil gas emissions, and we also have towers doing larger scale emission work. And then the HPL team is responsible for the hydrology and the chemistry. And so we're kind of looking at two different things, but we're collaborating together. We have meetings consistently. And that's been really good to meet other students, but also to learn about another field that I wasn't necessarily exposed to. And then last thing I'll say is that we've also been working with stakeholders, and specifically working with a farmer and an extension agent in this project. And that's been a really, really important and beneficial beneficial experience for me, because I've been able to see what is it like to have a stakeholder relationship. What does it even look like? How does it work? And also working with that farmer, I've been able to be exposed to what are the bigger issues with sustainable ag, kind of get that big picture point of view, not only from my scientific, is there more gas coming out of the soil and over here than over here, but economically, how does this best management practice impact the farmer and his decision to implement it? And then last story, I was working in the farmer in the field, and this kind of goes back to that stakeholder relationship. And we're out there, and I'm taking my soil gas measurements, and then the farmer comes on, his truck pulls up to the farm, and one of his pivot irrigation systems, one of the wheels was stuck in the mud. And so I see him running out because he's trying to get that wheel unstuck so they can continue moving this irrigation wheel. And so I stop my stuff, and I have another graduate student with me. So we stop our stuff, and we say, well, we'll go over there and ask if he needs some help. So of course he says, yeah, help me. So we're getting down in the mud. We're sticking boards in there, trying to get this wheel unstuck. But it was a really good experience just to see that in helping him with this, we were able to kind of this mutual respect and have this relationship. And it was a good lesson in be a human first and a scientist second. So.
Right. So there's a theme there of group science that I think we've hit on several times today. So in addition to agriculture, sustainability for food production and ecosystem services, also aquaculture is extremely important in our context. And so Matt Gray, who is an assistant professor at Horn Point Laboratory, whose specialty is in ecophysiology of bivalves, ecological restoration, ecosystem services, and aquaculture, will be speaking next. Matt.
Okay, so back, can you hear me? Back to the surf, right? So we know that the bay has a long history of watermen harvesting oysters, clams. Should I wait for that siren? I'll just speak over it. All right. The watermen have a long history of harvesting clams, oysters, and crabs and fish from the bay. Annual revenue generated from seafood harvests last year totaled $90 million and in Maryland alone. And this is driven principally by shellfish and specifically crabs and wild oysters. In addition to fisheries, as Eric just mentioned, shellfish aquaculture is actually rapidly growing in the bay. And it has the ability to bolster oyster populations and clam populations and represents a new avenue for entrance into the industry. Oysters and other bivalves provide numerous ecosystem services, as Senator Polinsky mentioned. So the idea here, too, is that the more oysters that we have in the bay, the healthier the ecosystem is likely to be. So it's important that fisheries and aquaculture become sustainable to ensure that the bay's health, but also that future users of these resources have access to them. However, there are several notable threats to the fisheries and shellfish farms. For shellfish fisheries, persistent threats in production include disease and over-harvesting. You may have heard that the first ever stock assessment in Maryland revealed that adult oyster populations declined by 50% between 1990 in 2016. And in many harvest areas, these oysters are not fished sustainably. There's also a scarcity of shell that limits traditional stock management practices. Nutrient loading, eutrophication, coastal acidification, these are long persistent problems, and they pose a particular threat to shellfish in the bay. But other emerging threats, including microplastics, pharmaceuticals, and organic pollutants also may impact these populations. But if they don't impact the populations themselves, they also pose a considerable threat to the quality of the meat from those individuals that are harvested. Looking forward towards the future, sea level rise, global warming, ocean acidification, they'll each impose different stressors on the ecosystem, and it's unclear how the bay's resources are going to respond to these threats. But fortunately, UMCES has a long history of studying the bay's environmental variability and drivers of seafood production. UMCES has demonstrated a key role in conducting both basic and applied science and helps regularly to understand how commercial species respond to this variability and developing technology that reduces production hurdles and production waste. I think IMET is a great example of that kind of work. So looking forward, I want to share with you some of my research interests to help stimulate the discussion that we'll have. It's just coming up. Testing. Sorry, technical issues. All right, so, but I thought that I'd share these research interests with you. It'll stimulate our conversation on the topic of fisheries and aquaculture sustainability. For economic sustainability of farms, we should really be looking to promote diversification among culture, practices, and products that help the industry quickly pivot when disease or other production hurdles confront the industry. This could also include developing specific oyster strains that are breeding, that are specifically bred to be in Maryland's waters. Currently, a lot of our hybrid oysters come from Virginia, which is actually a much different environment, much more salty, just as an example. It's going to be important to maintain and develop relationships with watermen and growers to help them become more flexible when confronted with production hurdles. Mechanization and gear optimization would help growers achieve scale more quickly and become more profitable. Right now, as terrestrial farmers operate their tractors from their living room couches using their iPhones and satellite technology, practices in the Bay are antiquated by comparison, and they're a century to a century and a half behind. You've got that backwards?
Nope.
I'm out of time? Okay. All right, so I'm going to have to skim over a lot of this. Mechanization is important because this is an important one, though. Because seafood production in the Bay is so intimately tied to the Bay's water quality and thus terrestrial practices. It's becoming increasingly important that terrestrial marine scientists work collaboratively to understand how these ecosystems and systems can benefit from one another. For example, it's possible that in the near future, oyster aquaculture may be incorporated into best management practices for farms through a nutrient trading credit program. But are there land management practices that can be done to specifically avoid impacting shellfish? Are there herbicides and pesticides that are getting into our waters that could be avoided that impact production? These are the kind of questions that we need to be working on together. There's a host of ecological sustainability issues that I could talk about, but apparently I've ran out of time. I would say of these that are in front of me, one thing that we really need to focus on is the interaction between fisheries, aquaculture, and the enormous restoration activities that have taken place in the Bay. We need to understand how we can leverage those restoration activities to both benefit aquaculture leases that are inside of the sanctuaries, as well as demonstrate how spillover effect of restored populations can benefit our fisheries in a sustainable manner.
Okay,
That's
thank
it,
you,
I guess.
Matt.
Thanks.
So we've looked at seascapes and landscapes. We've looked at sustainability issues for agriculture and aquaculture and the linkages between them, the linkages between seascapes and landscapes. Kind of fulfills our mission of Mountains to the Sea, doesn't it? But we've also, so you've heard from the UMCES participants, and I've asked Angelos Findikakis, who is adjunct professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University, also has extensive experience in the private sector, having worked for Bechtel, to give his reflections on what he's heard about what these 4 UMCES participants here have said, and what are the possibilities for organizations like UMCES or for academia in general to be contributing to these questions of sustainable landscapes and seascapes. Angelo's specialty is in water resources management, environmental flow, and transport processes. Angelos.
Thank you, Eric. I should start by saying that I'm one of the few people in this room who are not a full-time academic, and I'm not a full-time researcher. Even though I'm an adjunct professor at Stanford, my full-time job is with Bechtel Corporation, where basically I'm working in supporting different projects in water-related issues. And this involves a broad range of projects for the power energy industry, for the oil and gas industry, the mining industry, and civil infrastructure projects. So we heard that throughout the day that many aspects of UMCES work on studying the natural environment and also on the interaction between the built environment and the natural environment. And as you move forward, I think that, and you focus more on the interaction with the built environment, you probably will have the need to understand better and maybe work also with the engineering industry. So having spent more than 40 years working in this industry, I would like to give you my thoughts on how this industry approaches sustainability and what is the source, what are the sources of the interest of the EPC industry as the industry that my company belongs to, which EPC stands for Engineering, Procurement, and Construction. So what is the interest of this industry in sustainability, and why the EPC industry actually cares about sustainability? And starting with a list of issues of concern, primary first comes safety. Safety during construction and safety during operations. You understand that in an environment where the climate changes, we have to anticipate more severe conditions, and many of the projects that I've worked on are located on the coast, so we have to anticipate, for example, what would be the maximum storm surge, not only under the present climate conditions, but under future conditions as the climate changes. We have to anticipate flooding from tsunami or from river flows and a whole range of issues. So sustainability plays a very important role in understanding how it may affect the safety of, during the construction of a new facility and also during its life. And of course, what goes with it is the assurance that the facilities that we design and construct will operate as intended throughout their life, and basically without having any unexpected interruptions due to natural events and changing conditions. Third, equally important, of course, which is essential for moving any project forward, is compliance with regulations needed to obtain the required permits for the construction of the project. And I think this is where it's important any concerns about sustainability to be brought into regulations that actually will force our industry to comply with and therefore live up to the expectations that we have for a sustainable environment. What comes next is, of course, concern about the reputation of the industry and the public image, because we don't want to build a project that will end up in a disaster, or a project where we will not have anticipated some adverse conditions that may basically warrant the project inoperable. And finally, of course, as public citizens, we're concerned about the environment, but I guess if you look at it from the point of view of the industry itself, this is the order, I guess, that I see of priorities of issues of concern for the industry. Then I would like to talk a little bit about the collaboration between the industry and with academic institutions and different research organizations. And throughout my career, we've done this in different ways. For example, in some critical projects where we had to deal with different issues, especially environmental issues, we had to set a board of consultants where we invited key well-known academics and researchers to participate and meet with us periodically, maybe every 2 or 3 months, to review the project of the progress of the project and also assess critical issues. For example, several years ago, we were dealing with the issue of handling effluents in a fjord in Alaska, and we had a board of consultants with professors from Caltech, UC Davis, the University of British Columbia, and again, this group met quite regularly to assess our design and see if indeed we could actually ensure that we will not have a negative impact to the environment, and of course will also comply with all the regulations at the time. In other cases, we go out and we seek help from the academia and researchers in using their tools. For example, in the last few years, we worked with Professor Findikakis at the University of Southern California on tsunami studies, and also we work with Professor Jim Kirby at the University of Delaware also, and again in another tsunami study for a project in Florida. And finally, from time to time, we invite academics to give in-house seminars or short courses on very specific topics to educate our in-house engineer and experts. In closing, 2 topics very quickly that I would like to touch on is that one, I see that coming from, I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and coming from there, because we have many issues with the delta. Some of them are common, some are quite different, but obviously I see the opportunity of UMCES collaborating with the people who work over there, and Peter spent more than 2 years there, so he's in perfect position to establish this connection. And finally, the last point that I would like to make in terms of communicating, especially with the industry and people outside, I find the title of our panel a little restrictive, talking about landscape and seascapes, because to most people, these landscapes and seascapes imply the visible part of the environment. And I know that you guys are looking into the entire system, the visible and what we cannot see also. So I would be inclined to refer to sustainable terrestrial and aquatic systems rather than landscapes and seascapes, but this is without being critical of what you guys are doing. This is a suggestion.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that puts us in a good position to begin taking some questions from the floor for any of our participants. Yeah, there's one way back here, Dylan.
My name's Dylan. I'm at the Appalachian Lab. I was wondering a little bit towards the beginning, you talked a little bit about uncertainty, especially in ecological forecasting. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on communicating uncertainty in your models, and especially in today's age where a policymaker may want one single number, and you give them a couple of different possibilities. I think it was Ronald Reagan who once said, "I wish I had a one-handed economist," because it's always on the other hand, it might be this. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on communicating uncertainty in your modeling or your ecology work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. How do you communicate it? And it gets even harder when you try to communicate it to the public. And I've wrestled with that, trying to put things in terms of risk. When we talk fire, it's mostly risk. So at one level, it's just dealing with how many people look at the fires in California and think, God, I don't live there, right? Couldn't happen here, could it? But we remember just 2 years ago, we had Gatlinburg, Tennessee, had something very similar happen. Why do those things happen, and how do we get at it? And so first you got to start putting those pieces together. But then it's, okay, what are the factors that create that variability? So like in our case over here, the Southeast is burning a lot more. We don't realize it. Over 1 million hectares burn. But there's no trend in temperature-related changes or precipitation-related changes in fire danger, so how can it be? And it turns out that, well, we're getting more extreme. So we have either wet or dry. And when it's dry, we burn really well. But if you look at the average, nothing's really, it's not a problem. So one is looking at things in a more realistic way. We don't live on average any day or any year, so we have to work at the scale of the thing we're trying to relate. And then it's a question of, are we trying to talk just risk? Like how many of us make a choice of are you going to live here if there's a 2% chance your house will burn down in the next 30 years? How do you do that? But if you tell them that it's doubled in the last 10 years, now they get a little more worried. It's also a question of what's happened when. So it's like if you can get it right after, like California, you can motivate people very well, or they can understand that it's really uncertain and their town might burn next, So right now they're focused and they'll listen, but in 3 years they won't have any idea of it. So when we communicate it though, it's like trying to, at least what I've tried to do, like when I talked about the fuels treatments, I actually map it. If I can show what the probability of different things either burning, or in the case I was doing, is that they didn't burn because of certain activities, that helps, or at least helps managers to basically look at how you do risk, because it turns out it's spatial. And so I can set up systems so I can reduce risk in one area, but it actually increases risk in other areas. Low probabilities at other areas for high probabilities of not burning in one area. So it's providing the information both quantitatively but also spatially so that decisions can be made. There's no right or wrong. There's only trying to balance all of those things. But you can't balance it if you have no idea what those uncertainties are.
Okay, one last question. Yes, back here.
Good afternoon. I'm Lori Arguelles with the Alice Ferguson Foundation for Environmental Education, and I also serve on the Maryland Climate Change Commission. And it's more in that latter vein that I ask this question. I love that you're looking as holistically as you can about landscapes and seascapes. And if we look at something like carbon and sequestration, it has a pretty deleterious effect in the ocean, as we're learning over time, and maybe a more productive impact when you look at absorption of carbon into healthy soils and what it does to all the little microbes underground and so on and so forth. So I'm less interested in a specific answer about that, but more interested in how UMCES is looking at, we're not just, we tend to be ocean people or land people, but we all live on the same planet. So how do you see UMCES as it goes forward, looking at sort of like cross-integration on really grand scales in ways that maybe is happening now, but maybe isn't?
Helen, would you like to take that one?
Well, I think as a starting point, I really like, and Eric was one who made this point on when we were planning this panel, is that more of our courses are being co-instructed by both a more what you call a terrestrial person and marine person. For example, I co-teach the spatial ecology course with Matt Fitzpatrick at AL, so his expertise being in the terrestrial realm and mine in the marine. And I know there's a remote sensing course that similarly has done that, I think with Andrew Elmore and Greg at Horn Point. So I think it's certainly something that we're thinking about. And I think UMCES, given that we are a relatively small institution, just how diverse we are in terms of the expertise. And that means that it's relatively straightforward, since we know each other, if we had to seed these ideas and to ask questions. I think UMCES really has great potential for that. And I think some of it is already going on, and I think it's continuing to grow.
Okay, thank you very much. Will you join me in thanking the panel?